What's going on, guys? Chris with Cowdog here, and today I'm going to be making these timber frame sawhorses designed for beams. The lumber used here in this project is primarily a bunch of offcuts. I had a fair bit of cedar laying around from the Speakeasy Gate project, and I'm using the 6x6s for the work surface area of the sawhorse and 4x4s for the leg assemblies. Now you can certainly cut these with a circular saw on all sides, but I opted to do it by hand to get a little practice in and build some more muscle memory. I'm cutting at an angle and rotating the beam when I get about halfway through two adjacent faces, and eventually you'll meet on the other side. The key here is that I need to be able to find the center of this 4x4, which is now 3.5 by 3.5 after some very aggressive planing. I'm going to use the Sumitsubo here. Gets a little messy, but we're just going to mount the Karuko pin right into the end grain. Just like so. Line it up to my corner. Once I got it where I need it, corner to corner, snap. I'm going to roll her back up and just repeat it on the other side. So now once I have this X pattern on the top of my board here, I'm just going to line up the Sashigane right in the middle. You don't really want to do this on too long of a board because it sort of obscures the center point, but I think I can get this one pretty close. And that should give me a pretty accurate center line. We'll just double check our work. The center point, it's pretty darn close. This post is going to be housed right here in the center of this board. Since that post is about 3.5 inches wide, I'm gonna have to go 1.75 on either side. And I'm just gonna take my rule here, line it up, and I'm just going to drop a dot, basically, very small, right there on the end. 1.75. And then that'll give me something to line the Sashigane off of, to be able to give me the width of my housing. And then just real quickly on top, I'm just gonna mark out what will eventually become my waist. The housing is only going to be the same depth as the thickness of my Sashigane, so I'm not really going too far. So I just need to take a little bit of a measurement off of here just to run down. I'm not gonna go too far, but just to line up off of the width of my housing. Then I'm going to take the Sashigane itself, reference it off the surface, and that'll give me the depth of my housing. This is the post that will ultimately be housed into this foot assembly here, and then the beams will be laid across to create essentially the surface for the sawhorse. Now, this is cut to about 12 1/16 with the idea that will not only be housed in, but then there will also be a separate 1-inch tenon on the bottom. You'll have the same sort of assembly on the top. I already did these three as far as marking is concerned, and I saved this last one so we can go along for the ride together. Ultimately, what I'm going to need is a 1-inch tenon on either side, and the easiest way for me to do this is just to take my rule and mark off a quick little dab at the 1-inch mark, like so. And then coming along with the Sashigane, I'll line up off of that mark, keeping pressure on this side to ensure that I'm going to be coming straight across and square. And it doesn't necessarily matter if the ends are dead square. It just matters that my line is going to be square to my reference face. And then here I'm just going to line her up again, and we'll repeat that all the way around. Now typically you would have two reference faces that are adjacent to each other. I did not actually do that, and the reason being is that I've made this board perfectly square all the way around. Now on some of the other pieces I did have a little bit of a problem oversaturating my sumisashi with ink. I had used a little bit of water to just kind of like rehydrate the ink itself, and that's actually, if you're not careful, can cause a little bit of swelling in your ink lines. So that way your lines are not going to be as crisp. And it's really important when you get to the end, obviously, to make sure that your lines are meeting up all the way around. If you come out of line, you'll know it pretty quick as soon as you get to your last face. Right here, you can definitely see tenon and housing. So my top piece here that has my waist marked out, this piece is going to be hiding a much smaller tenon. And when I can, I try as best as possible to use references and reference pieces. So here, I'm just going to use my square here, and I'm just going to come off the thickness of my blade. So right there, and I'm going to repeat that on all sides. And the reason being is that that is going to create this as my tenon, and these pieces will be my waist. I'll also take this line and bring it down just so that I have some guides as far as sawing to be able to figure out exactly where I'm sitting. These leg posts are not all that different from a traditional king post in timber frame joinery. It's basically, as I had said before, there is a 1.5 inch tenon that is hiding within this crown, so to speak. So I'm just going to cut a number of different relief cuts across and then just take out all these waste portions here. And the way that I do this is I like to clamp everything up in my vise on an angle. If I have other work holding options, those are plausible too. And then I'm just going to saw and keep on basically the outside of my marking line. So on this side, I'll be on this side into my waist. On this side, I'll be on this side into my waist, and then all the way around. The nice thing about working this at an angle, it just seems to be a lot more conducive to the draw. And once I get down through this little corner here, I'll just kind of start raising my angle of my saw upward. Reset, and then just work my way slowly around. Now you can see on this one, I got a little bit offline, and that's actually not gonna be the worst. I didn't cross over into my keeper, but as I work all the way around and I start connecting these lines across, I'll be able to sort of take out that margin of error and continue to saw plumb. To connect these opposing saw curves and then come straight down, I'm actually going to start from this side, the opposing side, and then utilizing that pull stroke, really try and do my best to match up with that other curve. And then periodically you just want to go and check, make sure I haven't crossed my baseline. And this one looks pretty good. I want to check one more time. And then we'll start on this side, same idea. Now something important to think about is when you're sawing like this, especially using a pull saw, you really want to just let the saw do the work. You don't need to muscle it. Just a nice soft grip. And that's not too bad. So I can still see all my layout lines on my inner square here, and that'll help me so when I'm trying to slick everything down and get to that 1.5 inch tenon here, I'll still be able to have something to guide me. And then this is all just gonna be waste that's about to get cut out. So this has been a hot button topic on some of my more recent videos as well as on Instagram, which, speaking of, check out my other social channels at Cowdog Craftworks on everything. But when pairing end grain, I like to utilize water to soften the fibers and make cutting across the fibers easier and cleaner. I do caution you though, if you're looking for a more aesthetically pleasing surface, to wipe your components down after pairing to ensure you're not getting watermarks, otherwise your work is going to look like a dining table where the owners didn't use coasters. Now sometimes when using a timber slick, it can be a bit finicky coming from the end of the tenon, so I like to chamfer down the end of the tenon to my layout line, which will give me a bit of a starting point for my blade, and also a pretty good indicator as to how far to go before I'm at my proper depth. What I'm using here is paraffin wax, and the whole idea right now is that I'm just trying to lubricate the saw plate, so that way when I'm cutting it reduces drag and allows my blade to track a little bit better. And using my marking knife, I'm just going to come on the inside of my ink line and score a line. I'm going to do that on both sides. Here I'm just going to offset it on the inside just a touch. And that's going to keep me from getting a little bit of blowout when I inevitably start cutting here. And then I'm just going to cut a number of relief cuts. And that's going to make it a little bit easier when I'm chiseling out the waste. Let's flip this around. Come from the other side. And periodically when you're making these cuts, you just want to come to the other side and make sure that you haven't crossed over your baseline. And as for the relief cuts, there's not really any rhyme or reason to them. I try to kind of do them about 1/2 inch apart. I find that makes it a little bit easier for chiseling. Now your relief cuts don't have to be particularly straight. However, I do pay a little more attention to my cuts that are on my outside edges to make sure that I'm not having to take away a ton of waste. I want to be pretty close to that line, and I want it to be nice and even from each side. As I'm going to start blowing out this waste here, I'm going to use a 1-inch chisel, which is going to get me about 2 of these rows with my relief cuts. And the key here is that you only want to go about halfway to 3/4 in. Otherwise, you're really risking just blowing out the backside and having some ugly tear out. Just want to make sure that I'm keeping the end grain severed. And the idea there is that by severing the end grain, you're going to make removal of all this cross grain material a lot easier and a lot cleaner. But I want to use the router plane to kind of strike a little groove against my end grain shoulder here. If I get that channel set to the precise depth that I need, then I can use my plane, my kana in the middle here, to even this down and bring it to the line. And with a router plane, you always want to take very light passes if you can, but I'm only dropping down my depth adjustment wheel probably about 1/4 to 1/2 a turn at a time. And you want to make sure that you come from both sides so that way you don't suffer any blowout. And if I'm getting a lot of material sticking up like that, I can just take my slick, come through, and just slice that off. What it's going to do is it's going to give me an actual parallel surface, so that way the bottom of my blade will be dead parallel with the top surface of my workpiece. You might recall that when we did our tenon, I was using the Starrett as my guide all the way around to be able to measure the shoulder. So what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to take my square, line it up, and then use my sumisashi, get right in there, and strike my line. I'm going to repeat it on the other side as well. I can't really come across like this, and I don't have a blade that's going to fit in there. So all I'm going to do is I'm going to adjust this down to 1 inch. That should be about right. Just draw a line right here to start. I'm going to eventually connect those lines using a square or at least a straight edge that'll fit. Here's my little Japanese square. I'm going to connect the lines just like so. Get a little more ink. There's 1 and there's 2. Since I'm going to be drilling right here in the middle, and that's going to be my waste and mortise for that tenon, I'm going to have to mark center, so I'm just going to match the corners and draw a line. And that'll give me my center point, which is where my Forstner bit, the little brad point of the Forstner bit is just going to line up right there. Something to keep in mind is that my tenon is about 1 inch. Let me just double check here. Yeah, my tenon is actually just shy of 1 inch. It's about probably a 64th under. So I want to make sure that the mortise is going to have enough room, and I don't have to stress out about it bottoming out on the bottom. So I'm probably going to drill this mortise to about 1 1/8 inch, 1 3/16, something around there. And that's going to give me essentially the bottom that I need, and then I can hog out the corners using a chisel. The chiseling process gets pretty monotonous to say the least. Same principles apply here as before though. Sever your end grain first. However, I will work my way from the center to the corner, nibbling away at all the end grain before getting to the long grain. For the difficult stuff at the bottom, you can just sort of cross hatch your chisel cuts and then do a little bevel downward to get into those far deep corners. So it's very important to note that the way that this was all laid out as far as the tenon and the mortise and how I cut everything accordingly was so that I had a very slightly oversized tenon. So as you can see here, just lining it up dry fit style, and it's actually always going to be dry fit, speaking of. We'll get to that in a second. But essentially, this can't fit. Just straight out outright, it's not going to go. Since this is cedar and a softer wood, it'll actually be quite easy to sort of crush this tenon in so that way it'll fit the mortise a little bit more precisely. Then after it's assembled, I can rehydrate it by just squirting everything down with some water, and everything will actually expand inside the mortise to be an extremely snug fit. Traditionally, this is actually done on a small anvil, but what I'm going to use here is just my table saw surface as a little backer to ensure that everything is going to be nice and supported. And I'm just going to take my tenon, sitting it just like so, and using the curved face of my Geno hammer, just start tapping it. And I want to keep as close to the shoulder as possible. I might not reach all the way in there, but the idea is that I'm just going to start compressing the tenon. And you can actually see a bit of a color change. I'll shift sides here. So as I've impacted it, you can see the color start to change. And that'll help me line up to make sure that I am peening the right sections. And I want to make sure that I'm peening the full tenon too. Now you can also peen other components too, like let's say the shoulders and the housing are a little bit too fat. You can also peen those down. But here I just need the tenon. Everything else seems to be a pretty snug fit. Let's just do a little tester. It's still, it's so close. It is maybe 1/1000th of an inch off. So this is gonna take just a little more effort and work to get in there. All right, let's see, second try is the charm, hopefully. Yes. So that is probably about where I need it to be able to clamp it up and start forcing some pressure on here to get it in. So now that I have the joint at least started off and kind of fit to the point that I can't really bring it in together by hand, we'll set up the clamp. And I'm just going to use one of these K-body parallel clamps. If you're doing a larger timber framing application, probably strap clamps would be your better option. But here, these parallel K-body clamps are going to be just fine. And you can hear that, how tight it is. Woo! It's a little nerve-wracking, just because I don't want it to bust. Once the clamp kind of runs out of a little bit of travel room on your screw, you can just realign it. Make sure it's nice and centered. And then just start applying your pressure again. Oh yeah, that's the stuff. Look at that. That, my friends, is a housed mortise and tenon joint. And then since I want everything to expand correctly, and I mean, frankly, this is gonna be outside a lot, it's gonna get a lot of moisture content, I'm just gonna go ahead and wet down just the joint itself, and that'll cause it to swell just enough so that everything is gonna be nice and tight. And then I'm just gonna let this air dry and do its thing. As far as layout of the foot components for the sawhorse, those are going to be put into the bottom of this beam. So I've got the bottom side facing upward, and I'm going to mark a line that is the length of this portion of the sashigane right to the edge and strike a line on the outside of my blade. And I'll repeat on the other side. Now, to ensure an exact fit to my workpiece, I'm just going to use my actual post as the reference, set it up to my line, and I'm going to be actually striking this on this side. So from my line, I'm moving outward towards the end of my workpiece. And then I'll just repeat that on the other side. With the width of my post set up, I want to find center. So as I've done before, just line up to the corners, strike a line, and then I'll repeat on the other side, and I have my center point. Now, passing through my center line and being square off the edge, I want to create another line. And then using this line, I'm going to take half the width of my post, which is going to be 1.75 inches from the center, and I'm just going to dab a mark. Once I have that mark, I'll just take my little carpenter square, line it up, differentiate that line a little bit stronger, and then come through all my sides, repeat on the other side, and then connect those lines to be able to give me the outside border of my post. Voila. The key to hogging out the waste here is consistency, and for that I'm going to be using a plunge router. If you have a drill press that has enough travel, that could work as well. What I'm going to be doing here is taking about 1/8 of an inch passes or so. So on the inside of my beam here, I've actually marked off the thickness of my sashigane, which is going to be the housing for the post, and that will then give me the correct dimension to reference off of from time to time to make sure that I'm not getting too deep or being too shallow as I'm making these passes. Okay, so that was one pass, and something to really take note of is that I'm actually going to alternate passes between my two mortises. So after I make a pass here, I'm going to make a pass on this side, and I'm just going to keep flipping back and forth, and that's going to keep me consistent. So that way when I end up wherever I end up, even if I end up passing the line on accident, these two sides are going to be consistent with each other, which is the most important factor here. So I'm at my final depth here. It's a nice, smooth, even surface. I'm going to start by defining my end grain here, severing all my end grain, and then moving into my edge grain here to define my entire mortise. So this is my second mortise that is done, and I'm just going to check my work here to make sure that everything is nice and square, and I'm looking pretty good. There is a little bit of tear out in some of the end grain here. There's actually a little bit of an undercut spot here, but there's nothing that's really overly concerning, and the most important part really is to make sure that these lines are nice and clean, nice and square, and they are. And so long as there's enough proper contact around this whole edge, this should fit nice and snug. To do the secondary mortise, it's laid out almost identically to the one in the foot assembly, and then once the drilling and vacuuming and clearing of the waste happens, we just start hacking away. So I'm just setting up the dry fit right now, and some very instant reactions that I'm kind of seeing is that I'm going to also have to peen down the shoulder of my housed tenon here. The thickness of the actual tenon is not too bad. I'm probably only about maybe a 1/2 millimeter off. So just like I did before, I'm gonna peen everything down, get it set, and then rehydrate it with the water bottle. Okay, so using the curved side of my Geno hammer, I'm just going to tap, and I don't have to be too aggressive here because like I said, it's a pretty tight fit already, and I'm probably only about a 1/2 mil off, if that. And just remember, you have to use your curved face because that's actually going to give the indentation that you need. And then as for the shoulders, I'm just going to focus on this edge here because really what this does is it almost chamfers the edge. It's just a slight rollover to allow it to pass through your housing. All right, now let's go check the fit. Oh yeah, come on. It's pretty close. So from a preliminary look, everything is just dead ass perfect, but I think I'm just gonna use some parallel body clamps, the little K bodies, to draw this sucker together. The trick here is you wanna just work these evenly from either side because you don't want this to skew in any particular direction. You want it nice and even. I feel like it's about to bottom out. My layout line is starting to get sunk there. And the same goes for the other side. Oh yeah, that is, it literally cannot get better than that. Wow. And after that bit of planing on the main work surface, we are done. As I'm getting deeper down this timber frame rabbit hole, I intend on working with larger components. Having something low that I can sit on at bench height or on the workpiece itself will save my back and allow me to work easily on bigger projects. Also, an inadvertent design bonus is that I made them horizontally nesting, which is just nice. As always, thanks for watching and see you next time here at Cowdog Craftworks.